everybody, and welcome to this Nemesis painting tutorial. In this video I'm going to show you how to paint these character figures from Nemesis Retaliation, the new game by Awaken Realms, which is going to back us as we speak. I've also painted the two expansion characters as well. So get your paints out and let me show you how it's done. Enjoy. Well, here's my workspace in the main room of the house where there's some nice natural light. I've got all my paints, Citadel paints, on these racks for easy access. There's a wet palette, a brush, some glasses, high magnification glasses I just got from the chemist. These are all my contrast paints in one rack. I found contrast paints incredibly useful. These are greys and blacks and metallics, stuff like that. In here I've got washes, or shades as Citadel calls them. And here are all the base and layer paints, roughly organised by hue, so I can find something nice and easily. A wet palette. This one is by Redgrass and is absolutely essential if you want to paint miniatures. And get yourself a nice brush as well. This is Rosemary & Co, but just get a good quality sable brush that holds the point. Now I've taken my miniatures and I've got some double-sided tape here just to stick them on this box so I can take them outside and prime them. This is a very quick and easy way to make sure they don't fall off the box while you're spraying them. I'm using Wraithbone to prime my miniatures. I also use Corax White sometimes. I much prefer to undercoat in white because then I can use contrast paints. And some colour reference. These illustrations aren't great for colour reference, as you can see, but it gives me a starting point. First I'm going to do the flesh on all the figures, and Guilliman Flesh is a very quick and easy way of doing flesh. I could do all flesh variations in different tones, but I want to paint these pretty quickly, so I'm just going to paint them all with this flesh colour. And then later on I can highlight it in slightly different ways to give a bit of variation in tone. Now of course contrast paints don't always give you a very smooth, complete finish, but they are fast, and that's the whole idea here. And of course I will be doing a little bit more hand shading and highlighting to improve the effect. In general, when I'm applying contrast paints, I try and apply them as neatly as possible, and that way the colour isn't going on to other white areas of the miniature which I want to use different colours on. So I try and do it neatly. And also just be careful to mop up any excess that pools in recessed areas. Sometimes it can be a little bit difficult to tell the difference between flesh and sleeves and hands and gloves and things like that. So take the time to identify these areas. And in fact on this figure I painted the chest area and then later went back and realised that it extended underneath the necklace she was wearing and put it a bit more in. The next thing I'm going to do is choose some key colours for each one of these characters, matching their base colours. So for the officer, Ultramarines Blue. Ultramarines, it's a hard word to say sometimes, it doesn't roll off the tongue, does it? For the heavy gun operator, Baal Red. For medical support I've got a layer paint, Emperor's Children, that gives me that nice pink colour. For the recon figure I've got Xereus Purple, another layer colour. For the combat engineer I don't have an orange, a good orange, so I'm mixing Evil Sunz Scarlet and Flash Gitz Yellow together to make a nice bright orange colour. And for the contractor I'm using Apothecary White. So it's time to start applying those basic colours, and I'm going to be applying these colours basically to the overalls of each of the figures, and that gives them a nice colour that matches to their base colours. Though I probably won't be using those base rings when I actually play the game, but the colour on the figure will reference the dashboard of each character. So Apothecary White is a great colour, not only for getting a white effect but a grey effect as well. It just puts a nice grey into the shadows of a white primed figure. So in this case, I'm applying it pretty liberally over the whole figure because I actually want her backpack and some of the elements of this figure to be white as well, or this very, very light grey anyway. And because it's easy to paint over, I might as well just paint the whole figure with it. And there we go. Next up is the Combat Engineer, and as I mentioned, I'm doing a blend of yellow and red here to give myself a nice bright orange. For some reason I seem to be missing that paint in my huge collection of paints. But this is a nice colour and should fit the colour of the base ring quite nicely. Yeah, that'll do. Now, taking my miniature, as I said, I'm going to identify the areas of the overalls and paint it in this orange colour. Now, I use just a store-bought pair of glasses with, I think, ×3.5 magnification in them when I'm painting. You can also use a head loop, which is a thing you put on your head with a magnifying glass attached to it. Something so you can see really clearly. Unfortunately, I'm way past the days when I can do this with my naked eyes, and even reading glasses aren't good enough for this kind of magnification. I'm just trying to be as neat as possible here, but there are lots of little nooks and crannies on this miniature, so don't worry if you don't get it as incredibly neat. You can also always paint over things. And also the rest of the figure is mostly going to be in a dark colour, in black or metal, so it doesn't matter so much if it's not perfect, this application of paint. This one's probably the most fiddly of the character figures, but that orange set of overalls really stands out nicely against all the metalwork and the articulated rig that he's strapped into. Next up is the Recon figure, and their overall is going to be in this Xereus Purple. Of course, make sure to thin your paints down with a little bit of water. You don't want to apply them on too thick, and it's better to do a couple of coats than just one. That's much better than clogging up all the detail with thick paint. Also, when you're getting your paint from your pot to the palette, make sure you wash afterwards so paint doesn't go up in the ferrules of the brush there when you're actually painting, because it can dry in there and ruin your brush. So you want to make sure when you actually start painting that you're only using the tip of the brush and the paint isn't going up into the ferrule near the shaft of the brush. And that way you'll preserve the life of your brushes a lot longer. Now, because I've mixed a little bit of water with this, you can see the white coming through on the highlights a little bit, and it's not going on completely solidly. In this case, that's pretty handy because it gives a sort of contrast paint effect and a quick kind of easy highlight. Again, just picking out the areas of the overalls. It's got quite a complex kind of battle suit on this figure, so it's a little bit tricky. Certainly these characters have a lot of complicated war gear that they're carrying around. I don't even know what that thing is that's sticking out from its shoulder. It's obviously some form of recon scouting technical gear. But they're now sporting a nice pair of purple overalls. Talking about nicely coloured overalls, we've got the medical figure now, and Emperor's Children is the colour she has for her overalls. Now you can see when I'm painting the leggings here that I'm keeping the straps separate. I'm not painting over them. The reason I'm doing this is because I can use contrast paint to paint the straps, and I can paint that over the white. So it's nice to make this sort of base coat nice and neat. And there we go, a fetching pink jumpsuit. Next character is the Heavy Gun Operator, and I'm using Baal Red, a nice bright red, for her overalls. Straight from the pot, of course, with contrast paints. You don't have to thin them down in any way. You can, of course, use contrast medium to thin down contrast paints if you're going for glaze effects and things like that, but for now I'm just using them straight out of the pot. Our officer is using Ultramarines Blue for a nice classic blue colour. Again, just painting in the overalls, avoiding things like kneecap armor and stuff like that. There's a lot of armor or suit on this figure, so there isn't too much to paint in. Just a few little tricky nooks and crannies behind those suit pads. As you can see, I'm kind of batch painting these, in that I'm going through each figure and doing all the overalls in the key colours first, and then I'll do the suit armour. And this way it's much faster than actually just concentrating on one figure and repeating yourself. If I was doing them one by one, then I'd be opening the flesh colour and doing the flesh, and then doing the suit, and then for the next figure I'd be opening the flesh colour. You do all the flesh at once, it's a lot faster. So this kind of batch painting technique is really effective. Here's a contrast paint I use a lot, which is Black Templar. It's great for black, but it's not too opaque a contrast paint, and it gives some highlights as well. Now what I'm doing next is just the hair of all the figures. So some of them will be black, as in the case of this figure, and Black Templar is great for this kind of thing, as you get that little bit of highlight coming through. I'm also using Black Templar for guns. It's a great base colour to paint your guns. So again, with this batch painting, I can go through all the figures and do any with black hair and any with black guns all in one go. So this figure is coming along quite nicely. I've retouched a few flesh areas as well. I realised I'd missed the arms, and as I said, the bit below the necklace on the chest. Of course, the heavy gun operator has a huge gun, which I'm painting in black, and I've also given her black hair as well. And I'll be swapping my brush soon, because you can see that this brush is starting to lose its point. At the end it's breaking into two prongs, so it hasn't got a nice clean point, which is not good at all. Unfortunately, brushes, even high quality ones, do die after a certain amount of use. The officer as well is getting a black gun, black hair. There's also a little bit of a eyepiece or earpieces as well around his head, which I painted in black as well. Recon gets the same treatment, and this figure also has some gun magazines hanging from their belt, so I'm painting those in black. As for the combat engineer, at this stage I'm just painting his goggles black, because I'm not sure what I'm going to do with this suit, this rig that he's wearing. Time for some different hair colours. So Dark Oath Flesh is a darker flesh colour, more tending towards the brown, which I'm using for the medic's hair. And then I thought, hold on, that's not the effect I want. It's got too much of a contrast in it. So I got Doombull Brown and just painted a flat colour. The white was really showing too much through that particular contrast colour. And this is a much better basis. That's better. While I'm waiting for those to dry, let me give you 2 tips for dry brushing. These makeup brushes are really handy for using for dry brushing. So they're really cheap as well, and you can cut them down if you want to get flatter ends. Another tip is getting some of these stainless steel balls. These are from Army Painter, and if you pop these into your paint pots, you'll find they mix a lot better when you give them a shake. So I've got one of these little balls in every one of my paint pots. Next up, I'm going to highlight those black weapons. And these 3 paints, Dark Reaper, Thunderhawk Blue and Fenrisian Grey, give a nice grey-blue kind of highlight to weaponry. Now, you can just paint them in a grey without any blue in it, but I think this makes them just a little bit more interesting and sets them apart from other metallic areas of the figure. So with each of these paints, the highlight details are going to get finer as the colour gets lighter. So for the first colour, we're putting on some pretty chunky highlights, and then when we get to the end, it'll be just tiny little dots of highlight. Now you can see I've already painted the suit or the armour of this figure, and I used Basilican Grey, which is a contrast paint, and I'm not really too pleased with the effect, so I'm going to go back later and try that suit again. So this is why I've swapped to just doing the weapons after a failed experiment with that suit. So the next highlight colour, just smaller highlights. As always, just pretending that the light is coming down from above and it's hitting the weapon in those spots. So just edges. You can also use like this, just the edge of the tip of your brush to do those sharp edges. And it gives you a very, very fine line if you're careful. And then finally, Fenrisian Grey is the lightest colour I'm using. And this is just for some very, very tiny highlights. Bits where light would be reflecting off the metal. So just some little dots really. Tiny bits there. And that gives a lot of depth to the gun and brings out the detail. I then use the same colours on the heavy weapon and get those highlights in. Here's the officer, his gun done. His gun done, gun done, dun dun dun. So I'm going to tackle these suits again, and I'm trying Gryph-charger Grey, which is a grey colour, again with a bit of blue in it. And I'm going to use this for the suit of the officer. And basically I don't want all this sort of gear that they're wearing to be the same colour on every miniature, otherwise they're all going to look exactly the same. So I'm assuming they're made from different materials, perhaps ceramic, metal, or some kind of sci-fi thing, I don't know. But let's see how this works. But really when it comes down to it, when it comes to painting these suits, highlighting all the little bits of detail are the things that are going to make them look even better. This is really just a base coat. So it really does depend on how much time you want to put into highlighting all these little details later on. If you want to just stay with this contrast coat, it still looks fine and all the detail has come out, and it's certainly more interesting than just a grey effect or, what's worse, a plain plastic miniature. Now for the combat engineer, I'm using Nazdreg Yellow, and this just allows me to keep that effect of it being a combat rig of some sort. Reminds me a bit of the Aliens combat rig that Ripley wears, and it goes nicely with the orange. So I'm painting the larger chunkier areas of this rig in Nazdreg Yellow, which is a great contrast paint and gives a really nice yellow effect with a built-in shading. And that turned out nicely. Now that I've got all those areas of colour, the rest can pretty much be black and metallic. However, I am going to use Gor Grunta Fur to paint some of the straps on this figure. So the straps around the legs, for example, and his belt I'll do in the brown colour, and that goes nicely with the orange and yellow. Gor Grunta Fur, another great colour, a really good brown, which I use a lot. Just painting those straps now, and also his boots. So I decided to continue with this figure a little bit more and got out some Leadbelcher, which is a dark metallic colour, and just painted the safety rails around the front of the rig. So they're in metal, and all the other parts of the rig will probably be in black. But it felt appropriate that this rig at the front of the figure was just made of simple metal. And there we go, this one's coming along nicely. I'll do the black areas now with Black Templar. And after some careful painting, all those areas are in black now, and they really contrast nicely with the yellow and orange. And you can see this one's starting to really come along nicely. Now I'm kind of jumping from figure to figure now because I'm using different colours. So Ratling Grime is also another black contrast colour. It's a little bit warmer than Black Templar, and I'm using that to paint the straps on the medic figure here because it's such a nice sharp contrast with the pink of her suit. Now, contrasting colours is really important, and it's tricky coming up with colours for miniatures like these because there is no great reference yet for these miniatures. I haven't seen many painted versions of them, so you're coming up with your own colour variations. But just remember, contrast is good because it delineates the areas of colour on the miniature and it doesn't all become a big blobby mess. And there we go, those straps are contrasting nicely with the pink. I also used some more Ratling Grime on the contractor figure just to highlight some straps and some areas of the backpack. And again, some nice sharp contrast between the whitey grey of her suit. And also you can see the contrast there between the Ratling Grime and the Black Templar that I've used for the gun. So they're both very, very dark colours, but they stand out as being different on the figure, and that gives some nice variety. I'm really liking the effect of these two different dark colours contrasting with the light grey. Now I'm using Leadbelcher again for some of the metallic looking areas or mechanical areas on the heavy gun operator. Because she's operating such a heavy gun, I'm just assuming that some of these articulation points are just straight up metal. So I'm painting in some of those. It's kind of guesswork, you know, I don't know how all these bits of articulation work, but I'm just going with my gut here. In the end, it's pretty much the kind of tank thing on her back and the articulation frame around her left arm that are painted metal. Now I'm just using a bit of Black Templar to differentiate some of the areas on the officer figure, the bottom of the backpack and some of his straps. And it's bringing out these kind of little detail areas that makes a figure look more realistic, because if those straps are a different colour, of course, it makes the objects that the straps are holding in place look more obvious, things like that. While I've got the Black Templar out, I'm going to use it just to put a little dab of black in the eye sockets. And I'll be painting the eyeballs later, but it's important to just get that absolute blackness, just the tip of the brush. Be very careful and get the tiniest little thin line in there in the eye sockets. This is one of those many cases when you need a good quality brush with a nice sharp tip. And you're not going to get that with Games Workshop brushes or store-bought cheap brushes. They really have to be Sable. Winsor & Newton and the ones I'm using, Rosemary & Co, are both good brands. Basilican Grey gives me a nice grey effect, and I'm using that for the boots of the contractor, or her shoes I should say. Again, it gives me a darker colour, but it's different from the other colours that I've got on the figure, and it's all contrasting nicely with the white. Time to do a little bit of shading. Nuln Oil is your shade of choice on metals. If you just want a straight up black shade. If you want a more oily shade, you can use Agrax Earthshade, but Nuln Oil is good on this kind of metal, and it immediately brings out all the detail in that metal work. Always instantly effective. So here's where I'm up to. This is coming along nicely. I've just put Leadbelcher on the bases at this point. I'll do some more detail on that later. But we've got sort of the basic colours down on all the figures now. and they're looking pretty good. Now we're going to start doing a little bit of highlighting and also some little detail work. So there's a little red medical cross on the back of the medic's backpack. So a bit of Baal Red in there. And it's these little details that really bring miniatures to life. I'm going to start highlighting the combat engineer. So Averland Sunset is a really good yellow colour that goes on nice and thickly as well. And I'll use that to start highlighting the orange of his jumpsuit. And don't worry, I'll highlight the yellow with a much lighter yellow as well, and that will keep the contrast between the two. But using just the very fine tip of the brush here to highlight areas of raised cloth, the tops of the wrinkles of cloth, and this increases the depth of the miniature because it's a tiny little miniature, so we have to accentuate these color differences between high and low areas of surface, and that makes it look realistic. The basic principle of miniatures painting. And you can see a bit of highlighting instantly makes a miniature look better. Now some white scar, I'll mix that in with my yellow to get a very nice pale yellow. And now I'm going to use that to highlight the yellow areas. Again, just finding the edges of things, the bits where light would hit. I don't have to do every single little surface. I just want to do enough to give you that feeling of three-dimensionality. The object here is not to highlight every single little area, but just to touch those edges, those little highlights, just to give it a much more effective look. Remember, as I always say, these aren't display pieces, these are gaming pieces. So they want to look good from a distance. They don't have to look fantastic really close up. And let's face it, most of the photos we see of miniatures are taken from very, very close up. And they're painted that way so they'll look good in those photographs. But that's not how you see them when you're playing with them. You see them from a distance. So maybe those highlights have to be a little bit chunkier, and they don't have to be on every single surface to do the job. That's looking good. Now I'm using a bit of Dawnstone, a light grey, to highlight some of the black areas on the combat engineer. You need a steady hand and a sharp point. And I'm also using that colour to highlight the black areas of the rig as well, and the guns and mechanical bits it's using. Again, I'm just, as you can see, using the edge of the tip of the brush here and just running it along the edges to give that little bit of highlight. By the way, when you've got your paint on the palette and you're bringing it up, just twist the brush a little bit so it twists the edge of the brush into a point. It's just a little tip. And it gives you a little tip. Brilliant. You can see this is pretty rough and ready. It's almost like a kind of relatively wet dry brush I'm doing here, just so the paint hits the areas, the highlighted areas, and just brings out the dimensionality of the black areas there. It's pretty rough and ready, really. Just carefully painting in his goggles. They'll go almost to white. And a little bit more highlighting on the grey areas. I've mixed some white in with this grey so it's even lighter. Getting very happy with that. I thought the goggles were a little bit boring, so I just mixed a little bit of the blue on my palette into the grey and made his goggles just a little bit more blue. Now I'm using white scar to highlight the grey jumpsuit of the contractor character. White scar is of course your whitest white. And again, just in the same way, go over the highlighted areas, bring out the detail a little bit, the edges of the cloth and the raised areas of the cloth. And also, when you're doing this, you can clean up some of the blotchiness of the contrast paint by painting in more solid highlights. It's also a good time to really make the line between different colours really neat, and just use the very, very tip of the brush to put in those little fine creases to accentuate them. And that'll really bring your paint job to life. As you can see, I'm always turning the miniature around, manipulating it so I can get the best angle for my brush. And she is coming along very nicely indeed. To highlight the flesh tones, I'm using Cadian Fleshtone as a good basis, and I'll be highlighting that up with White Scar. When you're highlighting flesh, you want to get your brightest highlights on the bridge of the nose, going down the nose, a sort of T area above that across the brow, and the tops of the cheeks. Of course, these are very, very tiny faces and there's not a huge amount of detail, so you can just put in very, very tiny little highlight lines there to make little flesh areas pop a bit. And you can even get away with a bright white highlight just at the tip of the nose. And also on the knuckles of the finger if you want to do that kind of detail. If you really want to go crazy, you can mix a little bit of red in with the flesh colour and just paint the bottom lip with the tiniest little line. You'll be surprised how this makes a face come alive. Just the bottom lip, not both, otherwise they'll look like they've had weird plastic surgery. Now with the eyes, there's lots of ways of doing them, but I find this really effective, and that's to just to do two tiny little white blobs on either side of the pupil. Now these are particularly tiny pupils, so it's a little bit tricky. You may have to paint in the black pupil again. The other way you can do it is just to paint black in the recess, white on top of that, and then paint in a black pupil. But I find just doing the two tiny little white dots gives the eyes just a little bit more character. And it tends to avoid that starry-eyed effect as long as you make the dots tiny enough. You can also touch up around them with flesh until you get the effect you like. And I continue to do the same with the flesh of the other characters as well. For some of them I didn't use as bright highlights. The heavy weapons operator, I wanted darker skin, so I used much darker highlights, and I didn't go right up to the almost white on the tip of the nose, and that just gives the skin tone a much darker feel. So I'm really just using as the brightest highlight is just straight Cadian Flesh on this one. But remember, these are very tiny faces and they're not incredibly well detailed, so I wouldn't obsess about getting perfect faces by any means. I've mixed a dark orange to highlight the red on the heavy weapon operator. You can also highlight red with red plus white. That gives you a different type of effect. In this case, I'm using yellow as my highlight colour, or yellow added to the red as my highlight colour. And you get a sort of warmer highlight. But you can use pink to highlight red as well. When you're highlighting hair, you can either use tiny little strokes like I'm doing here, which I find quite effective, or you can just dry brush it if you want. Wipe most of the paint off your brush and just run it over so it catches the highlights. But I think these really fine tiny little lines just accentuate the hair a little bit better from a distance. Now, I said before that I painted those bases with Leadbelcher. Now I'm washing them all with Agrax Earthshade, and this gives me a nice shade of the metal on the bases, but it also gives an oily kind of brown shade effect, which I like. So I'm doing this on all the bases to bring out the detail on them. A few little brown details on the officer figure. I think I'm using Wyldwood here, which is a brown contrast paint, just to make him a little bit more interesting, because he's got so much of that suit on, the armor suit, that he just needed a bit more detail, and the brown went quite nicely with the blue. Now, I think I missed showing you the step, but I've highlighted the blue tracksuit a little bit on this guy just by mixing a little bit of white scar in with the blue. Not with the contrast paint, of course, mixing it with a layer blue, which was probably Macragge Blue, which is similar, and just highlighting those blue overalls. And yeah, that backpack's a bit more interesting now. Finally, for the bases, Runefang Steel. I've got an old brush here, and I'm putting a bit of steel on it and brushing most of it off on my paper towel, and then giving those bases a very light dry brush. And of course they've dried completely since I've washed them with the Agrax Earthshade. And then finally, when that's dried, I'm taking Militarum Green here and just painting some of the details on the base to make them look a bit more interesting. So for example, there's a sort of ammo case here on the heavy weapon operator's base, and a bit of that Militarum Green just makes the metallic colour more greeny and adds some variety to the base. I've done it here on the officer's base as well. There are some areas where I put in a little bit more Agrax Earthshade to bring back a bit of that slimy browny colour to the metal. And the last step, of course, is to line the edges of the base in black. You can line the edges of your base in anything you want, of course, but the classic way is black, and I've always used black for the edges of bases. And a couple of coats of that so it's nice and flat. Now you're probably thinking, what about the expansion figures? Yes, there are two more. This one's the Sharpshooter. I've used Skeleton Horde for his hair there, and I'm using contrast paint Frostheart for the blue because his main colour is sort of a light blue colour. So let's paint in his overalls in that blue. And that's a nice ice blue colour. Here's our UAV operator. I'm using Nazdreg Yellow. For some reason he has the same coloured base as the combat engineer. I'm not sure why. But this guy will be more yellow than orange. He also has a very sort of complex suit and armour arrangement, so there's only a little bit of area of uniform. Okay, so just continue doing those last two expansion figures in the same way as the other ones, painting in that armour and the cloak. Now, when you've finished everything, you want to varnish your figures, and I use this, which is Tamiya Colour TS79 Semi-Gloss Spray. Now, a lot of people like to varnish their figures with a matte varnish. I prefer semi-gloss because while you'll see in the finished pictures I show you of these, it has a bit of a glossy finish, which doesn't look great on close-up video, but during the game it makes the colours pop a little bit from a distance, and I really like the effect of it. And they don't look too glossy from a distance, they just have a little bit of shine. It just brings out the colour. But that's a matter of personal taste. You can use a matte finish if you want to, or in fact you can go full glossy if you feel like it. Okay, let me show you the finished figures. So the rest was really just tiny little details and touch-ups. So let's look at these in detail, very close up, so you can see the level of highlighting that I've done, which, you know, brings out some of the detail but is not super careful. Remember, we're not going to be seeing these figures this close up when we're playing with them. We see them from a distance, so this is really warts and all when you get them this close. But they still look pretty good, and they look great from a playing distance. Just putting in little highlights and little details makes them pop, but I haven't added any detail to that backpack because she's a medic, so it's all kind of white, and really the white was enough of a highlight. The officer here, I went to a little bit more effort highlighting this armour, just making all the little panels of it pop a little bit with a light grey, but there's so much detail in there, really it's difficult to do much more than that. Sometimes you want to reinforce shadows a little bit with a dark colour as well. This guy was one of the hardest because the armour is just very difficult to know what's going on in there. So I just tried to highlight the little details and panels of this armour to make it pop. I might do a lighter purple on those discs on his shoulder as well. They're a bit flat at the moment. Maybe even a red to make them pop even more. I think this one's my favourite. It's a really nice chunky figure, and it's really obvious what's going on, whereas some of the others are a little bit more complex. And I think this yellow and orange works really well with the black. Here are the expansion ones. The UAV operator, again just grey armour highlighted, a few little shades of brown, Ratling Grime, things like that for the backpack. And I painted that tank on the back yellow as well. And there's also some detail on the screen in there. I just made the screen green and coloured some of those buttons in there to make it look as if he was operating a console. Sharpshooter, again very basic. I used Wyldwood contrast paint for the cloak, and then just picked out some of the drapey strange details on the cloak in black Templar and highlighted them a little bit. There's a little screen there on the back. That's his cap at his belt, which is in blue. That's it for painting the doomed characters visiting the facility in Nemesis Retaliation. I will see you next time. Thanks for watching, and good gaming, everybody.